Bible reading today is from John's Gospel and can be found on page 1541 of your Pew Bibles. I'll encourage you to get that out. It's a fairly long passage. John 18, 1 to 27. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews came together. I said nothing in secret." "Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. Good to be with you. Good to be back. Well, we've just come to the end of an election campaign. And like many election campaigns, it's been the trustworthiness of the candidates that's been under the microscope. My mailbox has been full to overflowing with handwritten letters and happy snaps showing the candidates as trustworthy people. But then at the same time, my mailbox has also been full to overflowing with horror story headlines, with pictures of black and white villains showing them as strangers who can't be trusted at all. Now, it seems every piece of communication has been custom designed to win us over or to turn us against the alternative, to choose the good guy over the bad guy. And right now, who knows whether we've made a good choice? Right now, it's still all words and promises. But as we know, time will tell. If the political process tells us anything, it's that winning elections is easy, but character is proven over time. Consistency is hard. Integrity is rare. But this integrity and consistency, it's not just a problem for politicians. I don't know about you, but I find it very easy to overpromise and underdeliver. I often think that I've got something well in hand, but then something unexpected happens, which leaves me falling short of even my own expectations, let alone anyone else's. Even for people like us, character is proven over time, and integrity is hard, and consistency is rare. In our passage today, we see two people who we've gotten to know through John's Gospel, Jesus and Peter. And we're invited to look carefully at them, to consider their character, to consider their integrity, their consistency. We're going to start by looking at the consistency and integrity of Jesus. So take a look with me. After his prayer in chapter 17, Jesus comes with the 11 remaining disciples to a garden, to a walled olive grove on the other side of the valley. It was a familiar place, we're told, for Jesus and for his disciples. They'd come there regularly. And we're particularly told that it was a familiar place for Judas Iscariot. So Judas is here, along with Roman soldiers and Jewish religious officials, and they're armed and ready to arrest Jesus. Just think about this moment for a second. You're in a quiet garden in the dark of night, and you hear this noisy group of Roman soldiers lit up with lanterns and torches, clattering and clinking along with their weapons. There is nothing secretive or silent about it. How easy would it be to just slip away, to just do the bolt, to do the Harold Holt, to get out of there? But in verse 4, Jesus shows us his consistent character, his identity. This is what Jesus does. Verse 4, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. John tells us that Jesus knows all that's going to happen to him, just like he knew all about the plots of the religious hierarchy to take his life, just like he knew all about the betrayal of Judas that's playing out right now. Jesus knew that his hour was here, and these events will play out on his terms. So knowing all that is going to happen to him, Jesus goes out to meet them. He asks them the questions, and he answers them truthfully. And did you see the impact of his answer? The impact of his answer, of Jesus' answer here, is astonishing. See what happens in verse 6. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Can you imagine seeing this? This powerful group of Roman soldiers, of Jewish religious heavyweights, they're there to arrest Jesus. But Jesus' answer shows us where the power truly lies. The ones who appear powerful are the ones stepping backwards and falling down at his words, at the words of one unarmed man. Now, we don't expect words to have this effect. Even Jesus' words haven't had this effect en masse before. But we have heard Jesus say things like this during his ministry. And knowing this helps us to see why his apparently simple answer has the impact that it does on Jews and even the Romans who hear it. Jesus' answer, "I am he," reminds us of the name that God gave himself in the Old Testament. Remember Moses at the burning bush when God said to Moses, "I am who I am." This is what you are to say to the Israelites. "I am has sent me to you." I am is the name God gives to himself. And right through John's Gospel, Jesus has used that name, "I am," to refer to himself. I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the true vine. Before Abraham was born, I am. And Jesus does it to show his unique relationship with God, his Father, to show that he is God's Son, with all of God's authority, with all of God's power to act in the world. And Jesus has made his identity clear in his teaching. He has shown it in his miraculous ministry. And Jesus makes his identity, his relationship with God, his Father, clear again now. He shows it in this statement and in this supernatural scattering of those who would arrest him. He doesn't shrink back. He steps forward. He doesn't keep quiet. He speaks the truth about himself. He isn't powerless. He is powerful and in control. Even now, at his arrest, we see Jesus' consistency, his consistent identity as God's Son, and his fearless declaration of it. And the consistency of Jesus' identity here fills us with confidence, because this is the Jesus who we trust in. The Jesus whose identity as God's Son has not changed through his ministry and will not change, giving us confidence in his authority and power, in the relationship he offers us with his Father. That's Jesus' consistent identity. Secondly, we see Jesus' consistent care, his protection of his disciples here. Jesus says this to the arresting mob in verse 8. "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." So here at the point of his arrest, Jesus protects his disciples. He lovingly cares for the well-being of his chosen followers, his closest friends. They aren't arrested with him. Each of them, even sword-swinging Peter, leave as free men, as only Jesus is bound and brought to the high priest. Why? Because Jesus tells them to let these men go. Jesus' protection and care even continues when he's questioned by the high priest in the next scene. Look with me at the content of the questioning in verse 19. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I've spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." Now, did you notice one of the things that's happening here? Jesus is questioned about his disciples, but he doesn't give them up. He says they don't need to be pursued. They don't need to be asked about his teaching. because the crowds have heard it all. He hasn't said these things in secret. Don't go chasing after them. This is Jesus' consistent care. Through John's gospel, we've seen and heard Jesus saying he will protect and care and watch over each and every one of his disciples. In chapter 10, Jesus says, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand." And we see here in chapter 18 that these aren't empty words. These aren't empty promises given in safety, but will be ignored when things get serious. No. Because now, at the point of Jesus' arrest, at the point where he'd be most likely to turn on self-preservation mode, and under questioning at his trial, what do we find Jesus doing? He's fulfilling what he had said, protecting and caring for those who are his. This is what Jesus is like. He's not just words, it's actions. He doesn't just do these things when it's easy, but under pressure. His consistent care then can also give us confidence on this side of his death and resurrection. The Jesus who cared for his disciples, he hasn't changed. Jesus is still the good shepherd who cares for and protects his sheep, who promises and will give eternal life to those who are his, to those who listen to his voice and who follow him. No one will snatch us out of his hand. So after seeing Jesus' consistent identity and his consistent care and protection, we also see how both of these come together in a third aspect of Jesus' character, his willing obedience. Look with me at verse 10. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Now, we'll look at sword-swinging Peter shortly, but let's look first here at Jesus' response to Peter. As Jesus rebukes and corrects Peter, he shows that force and violence are not the way he's going to show his identity. That's not how he's going to protect those who are his. No, Jesus will show his identity and he will protect those who are his through his willing obedience to the Father. He's going to do it by drinking the cup that the Father has given him. Now, in the Old Testament, the language of the cup, it refers to a metaphorical cup containing God's wrath and judgment. Old Testament prophets and writers, they'd speak of this cup being passed by God to different people and cities and nations, and they would be made to drink its contents as a sign of God's judgment on them. That's what the cup's about. And this is the cup that Jesus is talking about. The cup that Jesus has now been given to drink by his Father. And the cup points us to the cross. Jesus is about to be arrested, put on trial, convicted though innocent, and he will be taken to his crucifixion. And in his crucifixion, Jesus will willingly take on the judgment that humanity deserves, that we deserve for our sinfulness, for our sin against God. Why will Jesus do this? Well, because of his willing obedience to his Father. His willing obedience to his Father's plan and purpose. Like his consistent identity and his consistent care, Jesus has been speaking about his willingness to do what the Father wants right through his ministry. It doesn't change now. In chapter 6, Jesus said, "I've come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all those he has given me, but raise them up at the last day." Here at Jesus' arrest, as Peter draws his sword, Jesus shows that his love for the Father, his willing obedience to the Father, it's more than just talk. Jesus will drink the cup the Father has given him, because that is the Father's will. and because that is the only way to deal with sin and secure the salvation of his people, that they will be raised up at the last day, that we will be raised up at the last day. Jesus' willing obedience is the only way for people to be saved. It's the only way to secure the salvation of people like Peter. It's the only way to secure the salvation of people like us. And seeing Jesus' consistency just leads us to see our need for him, the goodness of him. Now, after seeing Jesus' character, his consistency, his integrity in the first half of the passage, John draws us to see a contrast in the second. From verse 12, there's this scene that's going on inside the high priest's house, and at the same time, there's a scene going on outside in the courtyard. And the way that John puts it together is a filmmaker here. There's no coincidence here. John is drawing us to see a contrast as our view switches from the consistent identity and care and willing obedience of Jesus to Peter. In John's Gospel, we were introduced to Peter as one of the first two disciples to follow Jesus. Then in chapter 6, when Jesus' teaching leads many of those following Jesus to walk away, it's Peter who spoke up. This is what Peter said, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God." This is Peter. Later on in chapter 13, when Jesus, the Holy One of God, begins to wash his disciples' feet, Peter was the one who kicked up a fuss, wanting to protect Jesus from demeaning himself in this way. Peter said, "No, Jesus, you shall never wash my feet." And when Jesus starts to speak about his death, Peter is the one who declares his loyalty. He says, "Lord, I will lay down my life for you." And then, as we've seen here in chapter 18, that's what Peter was armed and ready to do, to defend Jesus, to go down swinging, to save Jesus. I think it's a miracle that Peter didn't lose his life right then and there. But this is Peter. This is the picture of Peter that we see. Someone who was willing to follow Jesus first. Someone who was spiritually perceptive, seeing Jesus as the Holy One of God when others walked away. He's someone who wanted to see Jesus honoured. Someone who was loyal and courageous, who was a fierce friend. Peter is not a lovable loser in John's Gospel. He's the kind of person you would want by your side, who you would want to have in your corner in a tough time. He's the best of humanity. But just like us and like the rest of humanity, Peter's character is proven over time. And integrity is hard, consistency is rare. As Jesus is bound and brought to Annas at the high priest's house, Peter and another disciple, probably John, follow Jesus there. John is known to the high priest, so he goes with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, leaving Peter to wait at the door. Then John comes back to get Peter, to bring him in, and he speaks to the servant girl to let her know that he's okay. He's coming with me. Now, being a servant girl, she isn't particularly important or powerful. And as Peter comes through, this servant girl asks a logical question in verse 17. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asks Peter. In other words, John's here. He's one of Jesus' disciples. He's bringing you in. Are you one as well? Making Christ known 101. Are you with Jesus? But Peter replies, "I am not." When we consider the life of Peter up to this point, this comes as a shock, doesn't it? Just 2 sentences earlier, Peter had taken his sword out to defend Jesus. He's shown incredible courage and loyalty in lopping off someone's ear so they wouldn't lay a hand on Jesus. And now, out of the blue, this sudden denial, the loyalty, courage, and commitment to Jesus that was so clear just minutes before can't be seen. But it's okay. I'm sure he'll dust himself off and do better next time. That's what we say. But look with me at verse 25. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. 3 questions, 3 opportunities to show courage, to show loyalty, 3 opportunities to continue to show consistency and integrity, to speak the truth about his relationship with Jesus, the one who he said he would lay down his life for. But 3 denials. I am not, I am not, I am not. And 3 statements that contrast with the clear response of Jesus in the garden. I am he. Now, Peter doesn't stay in denial forever. Later on at Pentecost, Jesus pours out his Spirit and Peter speaks the truth about Jesus. And that's good news for us. That's good news for everyone who's ever heard about Jesus through the testimony of Peter. But what about us? Even with God's Spirit, do we fail to take up opportunities to make Christ known? I know I do. One of the fascinating and terrifying things about our online world right now is that everything a person writes can be seen and searched through and scrutinised. Remind me again why we want to use social media. I wonder if you or I knew someone that was going to do that to us, was going to go through all the things we've ever written online, how much would we have to edit or delete to save face, to keep our reputation intact? And not to ramp up the paranoia too much, but what if the same thing was possible out here in the real world? If every word and thought and action was recorded and made accessible, not necessarily to the public, but even to our friends or family? How much of that would you want to be redacted or kept under wraps? If the truth about us was seen as clearly as we see Peter, then there are surely times when we could be seen as the best of humanity. We look pretty good. But the longer our life goes on, the more things we think and say and do, the more closely we're scrutinised, the more easily we're seen for what we are, the more we are seen as failed humanity. Now, this could be crushing, but for Christians, it's actually a comfort. As we see Peter's failure and as we see our own, here's what this episode encourages us to remember. Jesus knows. He knows human failure. Jesus knew all about this failure. And Jesus told Peter all about his denial before there was any evidence that it would happen, before there were any cracks in Peter's courage, before there was any lack in Peter's loyalty. This is what Jesus said to Peter in John chapter 13. "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." One of the things I love about the gospel is that it allows us to speak openly and plainly about who we really are. We don't have to delete the history. We don't have to keep up appearances. Even as Christians saved by Jesus, we don't have to pretend to be good people. As Christians, we know that we aren't good people. We are people who are acutely aware of our failures. But we live in the incredible knowledge that our failures against God, our failures to follow Jesus, they're forgiven. And this means that as Christians, we aren't shocked or shaken when sin appears. We want our failures to be brought into the light so that they can be dealt with, so we can repent of our sin and return to Jesus, who knows all our failures, even the ones that nobody else does. This makes us very different from the culture we live in. We live in a culture that can't handle the truth about humanity. Instead, we find our society saturated with self-righteousness, not forgiving or forgetting, just finger-pointing. Isn't it wonderfully refreshing and freeing that as Christians, we don't have to be like that? We can come out from behind that facade. We can say that this is who we really are, morally and spiritually. I can admit that I am inconsistent when it comes to integrity and loyalty and courage in my relationship with Jesus. I want to be consistent. I want to grow in those things. God's given me his Spirit so that I can. But when I fail, I don't have to cover that up. Jesus knows about it already. And in his supremely consistent character, in his consistent care, and in his willing obedience, Jesus has done something about it, giving his life so my failures against God can be forgiven. Now, as the curtain closes on the scene of Peter's failure, Jesus exits stage left to the next part of his trial that we'll see next week. And it's a trial that will eventually take him to the cross to deal with Peter's sin, to deal with ours, to deal with the times when our courage crumbled and our loyalty was lacking, with all our moral and spiritual failure. That's what he's going there to deal with. And because of Jesus' consistent identity, his consistent care, and his willing obedience, we can be certain that Jesus has taken the punishment for all our failings, for all our sin. And we can continue to look to him as we continue to fail. As you and I continue to fail, we're invited by Jesus to receive the forgiveness that he offers. And as you and I face the reality of our own inconsistency, we're invited by Jesus to depend on his consistent character, his love, his care, his identity, his willing obedience. How good is that? We're going to encourage one another to see Jesus' character, and we're going to prayerfully consider our response to him as we sing our next song. So in response to what we've heard today, let's stand and let's sing together, Consider Christ.